Hi, welcome back. We are going to be talking about two historical topics here in period three. It is 3.4 and 3.5, philosophical foundations of the American Revolution and the American Revolution itself. We're looking at two themes. The first one, American and national identity, and America in the world. So let's begin with the first learning objective, 3D. Explain how and why colonial attitudes about government and the individual changed in the years leading up to the American Revolution. So the first of these deals with the Enlightenment and religion. So a key concept says Enlightenment ideas and philosophy inspired many American political thinkers to emphasize individual talent over hereditary privilege, while religion strengthened America's view of themselves as a people blessed with liberty. So a couple of things here with the Enlightenment. John Locke had written about the idea of natural rights and the social contract, and this was completely contrary to the concept of divine right of kings. So in the picture here, you have common depiction of divine right. You see that the crown is coming from a godly hand from the sky being placed on top of the head of the monarch, and that is no longer going to fly here in the colonies. Another concept of the Enlightenment seen in the American Revolution is going to be the idea of popular sovereignty, that the power of the government is going to come from those that it governs, not the other way around. Religion also has an impact. The colonies were a very religious group. Some people that moved to the colonies did so in search for a place where they could practice their religion without being persecuted, and we saw that in John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill letter. This was a religious experiment in their eyes, and so they had divine blessing from God. Therefore, what they were doing in the colonies had to be right. So the next key concept here is going to talk about the impact of common sense in the Declaration of Independence. We'll talk about common sense first. So the key concept says the colonists believe in the superiority of Republican forms of government based on the natural rights of the people, found expression in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. The ideas in these documents resonated throughout American history, shaping Americans' understanding of the ideals on which the nation was based. So the pamphlet Common Sense that was published here in January 1776. You see a picture of Thomas Paine and what it looked like, one of the original printings. It called into question the current status quo in which England, a small island in across the Atlantic Ocean, was controlling this much larger territory with many more resources than could be found on that island. So if you're familiar with the Hamilton musical, one of the lines from that musical says, "Why should an island across the sea regulate the price of tea?" That was essentially what Thomas Paine was asking in Common Sense. He was saying that it's not common sense for that to continue. It also criticized imperial policies in Parliament, and for the first time, we see King George III being criticized as part of these colonial discontent. So up until this point, all of the negativity was being directed at the imperial policies in Parliament, but the monarch had been off limit until now in 1776. His pamphlet Common Sense was steeped in Enlightenment ideas, so he continues to build on the work of John Locke, popular sovereignty, and the social contract. Paine, in his lifetime, claimed that the pamphlet sold over 120,000 copies, and then his later estimates went up to 500,000 copies. Those numbers are unreliable. It's really hard to know how many they actually printed. He would not have had any idea, even though he's the one who wrote it, because he did not receive any royalties from the printers who printed this and distributed it. If it was 500,000, that's the high number. That would have meant that one out of every five people would have had a copy of Common Sense. That's just not feasible given the amount of printers in the colonies at this time. Some historians have said that it's likely no larger than 75,000, even 75,000 would be a stretch, just because of the availability of printing presses in the colonies. All right, so moving on to the Declaration of Independence here on the same key concept. It was written after peace efforts with the Olive Branch petition had failed. So the colonists tried to make amends. They, in their heart of hearts, said, you know what, King George III in Parliament, we don't want to be independent. We actually don't want to have any discontent with you. We want to have things go back to the way that they were before you started putting all of these taxes on us. So please take this as our apology, and if you would please just back off. Obviously, the king was not going to be very welcoming towards that message. He rejects it. And so the Declaration of Independence is the next step for the colonists. The Declaration blames the king for the troubles in the colonies, so very similar to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It calls out King George III by name, even though Parliament was the one that they were really angry at. They were the ones that were passing all of these imperial policies that were taxing the colonists without their consent. The Declaration heavily relies on the social contract to defend independence, and it also draws on John Locke's natural rights. So Thomas Jefferson takes the natural rights of John Locke, life, liberty, and property, and he turns them into the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, moving on. So learning objective 3E. So we're talking about the American Revolution now. So the learning objective is explain how various factors contributed to the American victory in the Revolution. So it begins with the British advantages. So everything that the colonists had to overcome, or the Patriot colonists had to overcome. It begins with, despite considerable loyalist opposition, as well as Great Britain's apparently overwhelming military and financial advantages. So here's the loyalist opposition. They were between 1/4 and 1/3 of the colonial population. We obviously don't have exact numbers, but by the best accounts, they were about 1/3 of the colonists who were patriots. Anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the colonists were loyal to the king, and then the remaining third to just over 1/3 would be neutral. So they would be willing to go along with whatever side was in control of the region in which they lived. Loyalists, they supported the king and wanted to maintain that relationship. They continued to view monarchy as the best form of government, and some of them took up arms against the patriots. And because they were scared for what would happen after the revolution was over, about 80,000 of those loyalists emigrated after the war. So they went to all the different parts of the British Empire. A lot of them that were in the New York and New England area, they ended up in British Canada. So they go to Nova Scotia and Halifax, and they build a loyalist community there that will have some problems along the way. They will go to Spanish Florida, or they will go to British Florida, and then it becomes Spanish Florida, and they'll have to relocate again. Some will go to Jamaica, other parts of the Caribbean, Australia, and even India. Britain's military was also formidable. They had just beat the French in the North America in the French and Indian War. They also had allies with most of the Iroquois tribes. So the Mohawks were some of the most important British allies. And in the top of this slide, you have two pictures. And both of these portraits are of the same person. And that's Joseph Brant. He was the leader of the Mohawk tribe. The one on the left was done by a British painter in England, and the one on the right was done by an American painter, Charles Willson Peale. So he'll become important as we get to talking about culture during period 3 later on, and how art begins to develop in the colonies. Britain also had enough money to continue to pay regular troops. So those are the redcoats that you see on the bottom left, and also they were able to pay other troops that they would hire that are mercenaries. And they are best known for their defeat in the Battle of Trenton at the hands of George Washington. All right, so now, despite all of those advantages, the Patriots' cause succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias and the Continental Army, George Washington's military leadership, the colonist ideological commitment and resilience, and assistance sent by European allies. So the colonists, or the Continental Army, they had some advantages of their own. As far as the colonial militias were involved, they, despite being undersupplied and underpaid, they knew the terrain well, and they were fighting in their home territory. So they had that going for them. The Continental Army that was led by George Washington, at its height, at its largest, had about 20,000 soldiers. And one of the largest victory was in Saratoga in 1777, which inspired the French to ally with the Americans. Now, the French weren't crazy about the colonists overthrowing a king, because the French have a king of their own, but they really wanted to stick it to their old rival Britain after having been defeated by them in the French and Indian War. George Washington's leadership cannot be understated here. He had some tough spells. So his defeat at the Battle of Long Island early on in the war and the winter encampments at Valley Forge also were very difficult. And had it not been for his leadership, all those Continental Army soldiers might have defected and gone home. He was really good at delivering these buzzer beater victories when it counted. So the most important of these was the Battle of Trenton. It was the end of 1776. Most of the people who had signed up to be part of the Continental Army, their contract was about to expire at the end of December 1776. And so on Christmas Eve, George Washington takes the Continental Army soldiers that he has, sails them across the Delaware River into Trenton, New Jersey, and takes the Hessian mercenaries by surprise, takes all of their supply, takes them prisoners, and so it really helps continue the momentum for the revolution. And also the painting at the very top here, that's not George Washington at the very middle, that's Horatio Gates. He was the one that was the general during the Battle of Saratoga, taking the sword of the British general that he defeated. All right, so more of these advantages for the colonists. The colonists had an ideological commitment. So self-government at stake. For some of these colonies, they had a tradition of self-government that went back almost 150 years. The women camp followers, they kept the troops supplied wherever they went. So they would do the laundry, they would do the cooking, and they would tend to camp while the troops would fight. There were also women who impersonated men to fight. So Deborah Sampson is the most famous example of that. She was actually wounded in battle, and that's how she was found out to have been a woman. Or women who were aiding the battle lines, who were called Molly pitchers. They were women who would bring pitchers of water, and they would pour the water on top of the cannons after they had been fired, so that way the metal around the cannon would cool down so that they could fire the next shot. So there was such a great commitment for the cause that both men and women took up the call and did whatever they could in their capacity to fight for independence. And then finally, we already talked about the European allies in the form of the French. So had it not been for the French, there would have not been an American victory, because the French were key in the final battle in which Lord Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington. That's the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. So the French naval assistance comes into play. It's really key. They distract the British Navy that is outside of the town of Yorktown. They draw them into a naval battle, and then in the middle of the night, they take the position that the British Army, or the British Navy had outside of the town of Yorktown, and they surround the remaining troops that had been stationed at Yorktown. And then George Washington and the French allies, they come in through the ground, surround them, and eventually take over. So the people, the French assistance came in the form of Admiral Rochambeau and Marquis de Lafayette. So they were the ones that were bringing in all the troops and supplies and directing the French aid in the colonies. All right, so for a recap here, the Enlightenment ideas present in Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence are going to have to be important. You should be able to list at least 3 of these Enlightenment ideas that are present in both. So whether that be popular sovereignty, social contract, or any others, you need to make sure that you know them for a writing portion of the exam. British advantages, including troops, weapons, and loyalists, and then the Patriot advantages included the home field advantage, the commitment from Belicius and the Continental Army, the French aid, and the leadership of George Washington. Finally, the war ends in 1783, 2 years after the last main battle in which the British surrendered at the Treaty of Paris. All right, that is it for this lecture. I will see you back with number 17 when we continue to talk about the influences and the impacts of the Revolutionary War.